Economics looks for patterns, universal laws of human action, just like hard sciences do. But economics also has to account for the open-ended creativity and complexity of human choice. You've read about what has happened up until now in history books. What model does a historian use to choose which facts to highlight or include in their story? A scientific approach to history attempts to identify causal sequences of events. This happened, then that happened, and then the next thing happened. The historian is crafting a narrative around an interpretive framework. Sociology, cultural anthropology, psychology, all of these examine the formation of individual preferences, what forces in society shape what it is that people want. Some people say that capitalism makes people greedy. Is that true, or is it more likely that greed is simply a universal trait of all human beings? There are things that do shape our preferences. That's the realm of sociology. Why is filet mignon a delicacy, but not rats or beetles? What makes you want what you want, or think the thoughts that you think? Where does disgust come from? Economics is much less bold in the basic questions that it seeks to answer. By limiting our scope of investigation, economists have more powerful insights. Economists take the values, wants, needs, and desires of individuals as given. We use a Latin phrase, de gustibus non est disputandum, to describe that, which basically means that which you want, we're not going to argue about, or there's no accounting for tastes. You want what you want, and I don't care why. Then economics investigates how individuals with different characteristics interact with one another in the social nexus that involves exchange. We have different preferences, and in some sense, that's what makes it worth being around one another. Economics uses theory. To achieve our explanations, we build a model. George Bernard Shaw once said, if all the economists in the world were laid end to end to end, they still wouldn't reach a conclusion. That's just utter nonsense. Economists often disagree with each other when they are asked to answer questions that involve uncertainty or normative matters. Reporters and politicians are fond of asking economists about the future, what will happen. Now, no one is consistently good at predicting the future. If I were, I would spend more time on Wall Street or in Las Vegas. No one knows the future before it happens. I can't know what's going to happen. Now, if you give me some assumptions, I can derive some plausible conclusions, but that doesn't mean that I know that those assumptions are going to be true. Reporters and politicians will also ask economists questions that have to do with normative matters. Normativity has to do with shoulds. Economics tries to be positive in its analysis, to focus on ises rather than oughts. The distinction between positive and normative questions is crucial. It has to do with our interpretive framework. A positive statement is an analytical and empirical investigation of cause and effect, of real things actually happening. A normative statement proposes what should be done. It presumes that there's a set of morals or norms that everyone agrees about. But, as I've said already, we sometimes disagree. Economists, in this sense, are not any different from any other kind of scientist, like a biologist or a physicist. Could any biologist describe the process of genetic engineering and gene splicing? Of course. Do all biologists agree as to whether we should use genetic engineering? No. That's a value judgment, and everybody's personal subjective values are different. Should any nuclear physicist be able to explain the process of nuclear fission and what happens when the uranium atom is split? Of course. But do all nuclear physicists agree that we should use that power of splitting the atom for nuclear energy? No. Attitudes toward risk and other factors lead to disagreement among nuclear scientists. Same is true for economists. When it comes to normative or predictive matters, we sometimes disagree. However, what we tend to agree about is the use of theory. Without a theory, it's impossible to form a hypothesis to use in experiments, and then hence it's impossible to do science. We need a theory, if for no other reason than to prove it wrong. We rely on theories, or sometimes we call them worldviews to interpret the world around us. A theory is like a road map. My dad used to appoint me as the navigator, or the aggravator really, for road trips, and to let me keep track of the mile markers on the side of the road in order to prepare him for our exit, as indicated on the map. Of course, the map was not equivalent to reality. It was an abstraction. We moved from Bloomfield, New Jersey to Albuquerque, New Mexico when I was 12 years old. That's a trip of 1,982 miles. We most likely used 6 or 7 maps for that trip. Did the maps look exactly like those 1,982 miles? Of course not. How long would the map have had to be exactly a reflection of reality? Imagine unfolding that map as we're driving along at 65 miles an hour. Even our modern GPSs are not an exact representation of every mile. They get closer, and they avoid all the folding and unfolding. I once pulled a car while trying to fold a map before a traffic light. It was dangerous. Most of the time, we just use the map feature of our GPS and don't use a Google Street View for the entire trip. We abstract away topography and foliage. Most of the time, we don't want to see where the buildings are, just where to make our turn. Theory has to abstract away details and irrelevant factors from the phenomenon that we're interested in studying, the causal relations of interest. For example, Sir Isaac Newton abstracted away from the color of falling objects to develop a theory of gravitation and falling bodies. Newton assumed that color was irrelevant to falling objects. Theory therefore rests on assumptions. We need something other than facts. We need a hermeneutic, or an interpretation of those facts. A hermeneutic is an interpretive framework that you bring to a text. The economic way of thinking is a hermeneutic, a way of understanding the world, how it is that order emerges without anyone being in charge. Here are some facts. Al Smith was the first Catholic to run for president in 1928. Geese have serrated tongues. The Toronto Raptors won the 2019 NBA championships. The price of a barrel of crude oil was $41.83 yesterday at market closing. In May 2011, it was $111.43. These are all facts. What do they tell you? Nothing. I can string together an untold number of unrelated facts that would provide you with nothing useful, just utter nonsense. There is no story connecting all of these things together. Theory is helpful because it helps us to make sense of facts. Theory places facts into a causal relationship for empirical testing. Like Newton, who disregarded the color of falling bodies, you will probably disregard any information about geese when trying to explain shifts in the price of crude oil. Any scientific theory starts with assumptions. For example, astronomers assume that light travels at 186,000 miles per second. This can't be proven, but it's a useful assumption that provides positive results in scientific study. Economists are not unique in making assumptions, although those assumptions that we do make are peculiar to our discipline. However, economics does have a little problem with theory. Because economists are trying to explain human behavior within the context of exchange relationships, but we are also human, we can't be completely objective the way that a physicist can be about gravity. This makes economics really difficult, and maybe not even a science. Arnold Kling writes and asks, is economics a science? Some people, mostly economists, believe that it is. On the other hand, other people, mostly non-economists, are skeptical or even scornful of what economists teach. I think that both camps are guilty of underestimating the challenge of arriving at economic understanding. Those economists who claim the mantle of science are guilty of hubris, of being too prideful. Non-economists who think that their own intuition is superior to economic reasoning are dangerously misguided. Imagine that you had a scale to measure the carefulness with which someone reasons about a subject. Let that scale run from 1 to 5, with 1 representing the most careless sort of reasoning, filled with superstition and personal biases, and 5 representing scientific reasoning based on mathematical logic and experimental observation. Where does economics fit in? I believe that good economics is at least a 6. That is, good reasoning in economics requires more careful thinking than good physical science for 2 reasons. First, there are more causal factors at work in economics than in physics. Second, although physical relationships are relatively stable, the economy is constantly evolving, including evolutions in response to the government's attempts to intervene. Economics is hard, but rewarding. With the economic way of thinking, we lose some of the romance of politics, but we gain insight into the great wonder of markets.